officially we go by a digital magazine, but I think website will suffice. I met the editors, and I sort of pitched them this idea I had about why we don't see labor unions in kitchens, and from there we kind of took off. And now here I am, a staff writer, writing about issues of race and food, but also all kinds of other issues that are food adjacent. Last week I wrote an article about an ordinance that was just passed by the Tulsa City Council to ban new convenience stores and dollar stores within a mile of pre-existing stores in North Tulsa, which is a overwhelmingly African-American, very poor neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Right now I'm doing a lot of reporting on rural broadband, some of the sort of policy and structural barriers to getting broadband out in farming communities. And then from time to time I go to conferences. Last month I was in DC for a consumer-facing consumer packaged goods conference. A month earlier I was in Kansas City at the National Farmers Union Convention, which is like a confederation of family farmers, which is not most of farming, but certainly culturally the most, I don't know, heartwarming demographic of farmers, I guess. And then actually about a month after I started writing for the New Food Economy, I went to this conference at Stone Barns with my colleague Hillary, which is not far from here. Has anyone been to the Stone Barns Center? Yeah? Okay. So this was my first time going there. There's an outpost of a very expensive New York City restaurant there called Blue Hill, but it's also a former, I think, estate gifted or owned by the Rockefeller family that has now become a center for sustainable and organic agriculture. And when I was there, I think I mentioned in the article, I spent the day kind of going to different conferences or different panels about what's the best way to rotate your crops, how do you get the most out of your soil, what are some of the different federal subsidies that would be available to young farmers who want to do sustainable work. And then at the end of the day, we were sitting down for dinner, and this confrontation just kind of happened in front of my eyes. And as a reporter, I wrote it up, and the next day we published it, and Leonard saw it somewhere and wrote me an email.
Yeah.
So that's just what I'm all about.
Well, we'll talk about that in a bit.
Sure.
Let's just step back. What is the New Food Economy, this digital magazine, and this concept?
Sure. The New Food Economy is pretty explicitly like a post-Michael Pollan publication. I don't know if you guys, are you familiar with Michael Pollan's work? Okay, so we sort of take as a baseline assumption that people who read the New Food Economy care deeply about issues in American food and production and have sort of a critical perspective of it. That doesn't mean necessarily that we are advocates in the way that Pollan has become, or that a lot of other publications in this space are. We're not trying to find solutions. We're not writing about the missing link in the supply chain that can help scale sustainable practices. We're more interested in the official, the line that we use is food is the central character in a story about our lives. So any sort of way that you can look at food as playing a part in larger social or cultural trends, economic, labor trends, that's where we come in and do our work. Our audience tends to be people in the field, not literally the farm field, but people who work in the food industry, marketers, processors, chefs, farmers, advocates, public health people, big farming organizations like Farm Aid, or organic co-ops like Organic Valley. And I think what we do for them is sort of understand that they know there are problems with the food system, for lack of a better term, and we describe what's emerging.
And there are sort of, just to think about this in the media sense, there are kind of like competing, certainly online publications. I know there's Modern Farmer, I imagine there's like the USDA tracks certain kind of policy things. Where, does your publication sort of fit in that larger field? How do you distinguish yourself?
All right, well, I looked at the syllabus. You guys have been reading Modern Farmer articles. I think vis-a-vis Modern Farmer, we tend to be more I guess more policy focused than they are. My sense is that Modern Farmer is about trends and culture a little bit more than we are. Another site that a lot of our readers also go to is Civil Eats. This is a nonprofit. Oh yeah, we're a nonprofit newsroom. There are 7 of us. 2 of us are reporters, 2 are editors. So we're a pretty small operation, and we often look at what Civil Eats is doing. Civil Eats, I think, is either partnered with The Nation or Mother Jones. It's a progressive nonprofit newsroom where if Modern Farmer is more about culture and trends, I would think that Civil Eats is more about activism and maybe pushing the discourse in a way. We really get down into the fine, gritty details of policy and economics. Our name is the New Food Economy.
It's interesting because you saw the syllabus. Like, I'm driven when we're going on a field trip. The first thing I do is what has been written about our farms.
Yeah.
And so I'm just looking at who's ever written about them. And I often run across publications like Edible Hudson Valley or, Valley Table. And now we're starting to veer, first not only in terms of regional publications, but then, while they find it interesting, tell us the story about your farm. These are not agricultural publications. And in some cases, they're just like local lifestyle magazines. Right?
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that food is this theme that there's actually a number of different genres of reporting and publications.
Sure. Well, so just in terms of, actually my colleague Claire Brown used to write for Edible. So we do Edible Brooklyn, I think. So there is some overlap.
Okay.
But as you're talking, I'm thinking about what Edible does and the idea that we're going to look at specific farms. Maybe to a fault, but we really try very hard not to profile individual farms, individual startups, individual products. This is just sort of an editorial philosophy that we don't want to give too much shine to any one person or product. And then something else that I was thinking as you're saying this is that we write about agriculture. Agriculture is a huge, one of the biggest industries in America, and I think one of the first things I learned when I got to the New Food Economy is that the sector that describes the production of fruits and vegetables and nuts is called specialty crops. And I can't remember the exact number, I think it's like less than 9% of American agriculture production is in specialty crops. So if we take that number to be basically true, then 90% of American agriculture is stuff that you don't even eat as a whole food. Corn, soybeans, all the stuff Michael Pollan talks about. So we report about that industry. So that takes us pretty far away from the small farms in the Hudson Valley that are making great produce, or growing great produce.
Okay. So I find this concept of new food economy interesting because certainly I've been trying to think about and hear what students have to say about something that, for a lack of a better word, I call new agriculture. We used one of the articles that you pointed us to that said, if you want to talk like young farmers, let's be real, there's still people working in big,
sorry, young farmers, they're mostly white.
Yeah. Not just white though, but they're still doing very traditional agriculture,
yes.
Right? And so, but what's interesting is that I read one of the responses and they said, no, we're at least, younger and, in some regards more diverse, but we're hard to track. And it is an interesting question. If you look at just farms and farmers, the picture is still an overwhelmingly conventional one.
Right.
But and so new food economy is an interesting concept because it links up people who are not just farmers,
right.
But they're also food advocates. It links up with, public intellectuals who are not just Michael Pollan, but there's a lot of cooking writers. Michael Bittman was one that you read about.
Mark Bittman, yeah.
Mark Bittman. And then as we get down to local level, then it gets into things like, community media, community development, economic development, tourism,
right.
stuff like that. it seems like there's a coherence to it, but they're not just an industry, right? It's this multi-pronged kind of thing that...
Yeah, well, I mean, again, as you're talking now, I'm thinking about how far our tentacles can go, how broad our reach can go as reporters, and we spend a lot of time talking about like what's happening in cities, the way people consume food. I mean, that tends to be, when you talk about other food media, that tends to be the province of someone like Eater, very focused on the consumer end, what Michael Pollan would call the eater end. But we like to write about things like delivery systems. We like to write about the gig economy as it relates to food production, but also distributing and selling food. So yes, there is, at least in cities, there's a whole lifestyle around food. There's a whole way that people think about food as sort of being a part of their identity. This is obviously no surprise to you guys. I was thinking about this recently. I wrote a story about a rehab center in Orange County, near John Wayne, that treats, it's a rehab center for kids who have bipolar disorder, ADHD. I think 70% of them are suffering from eating disorders. And they sucked me in because they have, one of their sort of treatment plans is the meal as medicine. So we're not talking about just the nutritional content of food, getting more fiber in your diet, but how the actual ritual of eating together, serving someone, being at a dinner table can be kind of therapeutic and restorative and get at some of the issues that, get at some of your traumas. And I'm talking to the head chef, the guy who kind of designed all this, and he was talking very specifically about the Instagrammable moment. And I think what he meant to say by that is there are a certain set of anxieties that are imbued in the way we package and produce and disseminate our food. And I think when you talk about the sort of new ag, that is where we come in, is not just how do we consume this, how do we, amp up production, but how do we make it a part of our body and how do we create our identity around that?
Yeah, so, it seems in particular contrast to conventional food, which is, industrial food, where like a useful idea is alienation, right? In so many ways, we are alienated from our food, where it comes from the places where it's grown, right. The distance and the processing that food takes, how we think about food, how food is, processed and marketed, and those are, two of the same things. Mm-hmm. My favorite example is the Hot Pocket, right? The Hot Pocket is it a food type or is it a marketing concept, And it's so thoroughly corporate and, marketing driven, right? Well, by contrast, this seems to, you said like your readership is, has a critical focus. I mean, it is fascinating how everyone's just trying to unalienate themselves from the different elements of food.
But let's talk about something like the Hot Pocket. I mean, maybe that is, I don't know where in this sort of schema this fits, if that's old ag or new ag. Hot Pockets have been around.
It's old ag.
Okay, but still, so I think our readers are like, oh my God, a Hot Pocket, like how did that come into being? And I think part of what our reporting does is show that different agricultural interests, different lobbies, we tend to do a lot of reporting about the way they will push those products on the American public. I don't know if this is news to you guys. It was news to me as someone who had literally never reported or really read about food, that beef, avocado, specialty crops, so many of the biggest American produced products pay into these things called checkoffs, which are basically mandatory taxes levied by the USDA on these consumer groups that go into two things, marketing and research. So Got Milk, for example, comes from the dairy checkoff. Every dairy producer has to pay money into this to find a way to push their product on the public. So when you see that Pizza Hut is now doing 30% more cheese in their pizza, or that Taco Bell is like an extra cheesy chalupa, this is very explicitly tied to the industry and them trying to figure out how do we get rid of our surplus. When I found out that the link between the two was so close, that seems obvious in retrospect, but it really blew my mind. So I think what we like to do is we like to look at something like the Hot Pocket and just figure out like, okay, where is this coming from? Sort of what are the economics of this? How did this start happening now? But we haven't written about Hot Pockets. So. Not yet.
You can have
Not
that.
yet.
You can have
Thanks,
that.
Leonard. The rebirth of the Hot Pocket for the transparent generation.
Now,
Where your flake is coming from.
see it now.
Sorry, when I say transparent, I mean like transparency. This is a big food buzzword. I was at a conference in Washington, D.C. where people were talking about how the new thing is that consumers don't like seeing long scientific names on their ingredient list. They like to see vitamins B6. Marketers call that transparency. That's not really transparency, but the idea is that you're empowering people to know what's in their food.
Okay. So now we're just looking at the Hudson Valley, which, you know, and particularly it's like the 6 counties around Dutchess County. But when you said you went to Stone Barns, I mean, that's the bottom end of a longer idea of the Hudson Valley. And of course, it goes all the way up to Albany. And we looked at some of the, you know, trends in farming here, and we're checking out some of the, not just farms, but some of the places around it. You have a national view, but I would imagine, you know, there are like hotspots or centers of activity and movement and innovation in this sort of broader new food economy.
Mm-hmm.
Where are those places in the U.S. and how does the Hudson Valley rank in them?
Great question. Not sure I totally know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I know, like Napa and...
So California.
Well, I'm just thinking I was out there recently, and if you go north of San Francisco, in Marin County, residents voluntarily tax themselves to codify organic dairy. That's not really new. That's old, but that's one example of a way that a certain locality can kind of claim a certain production or a certain industry. Other food hotspots. Gosh, I don't know about that. I'm so like far up like who's got good rural broadband these days, but they're all like commodity farmers.
So,
I mean, do you want to talk about some of the places that you've been
let me just put it
to?
this way, like, you know, often, at least some of the ideas that excite people, like direct-to-consumer marketing,
Yeah.
right? Farm to table,
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, developing closer relationships between like restaurants or just
Mhm.
eaters and farmers. One thing that I recall hearing is that has to be understood kind of like in the, you know, urban-rural context.
It has to be close to a city.
Yeah, explain that.
Okay, if you are selling direct to consumer, which I think one of the articles mentions is a sliver of the agricultural economy, something like $1.5 billion in sales last year in direct to consumer, meaning a community supported agriculture, a farmer's market, farm to table, selling to a restaurant. You guys all know what those terms mean. That has to happen somewhere close enough, and this is going to seem obvious, where the farmer has to drive to urbanites who want that stuff. So
You literally need a critical mass of potential consumers.
right, otherwise it's just not worth it for you. You're making all this stuff, you aren't going to have enough customers.
And traditionally, agriculture takes place in the absence of critical mass of population.
Agriculture has traditionally never gone through cities. Agriculture goes through these processing plants in the middle of nowhere that get put into flatbed trucks and driven to distribution centers on the outskirts of those cities. So that's many more steps. So you've got me thinking now, like at least when I do clip searches, when I'm looking at daily newspapers, you'll see like Minneapolis, Des Moines, St. Louis. Those are 3 big traditional ag cities. You'll find, or Indianapolis, maybe this is just a reflection of my research and what I read, but where you see big ag, where you see pork and soybeans and beef and all that, you will also find direct-to-consumer farms.
Okay. I mean, another thing you mentioned, and let me just repeat, it was what you called specialty crops, fruits.
Fruits and vegetables and nuts.
That's
Specialty
only
crops.
9% of farms?
It might even be less than 9%.
Because that's...
Total agricultural production of American farms.
Okay, because that's like overwhelmingly
What you buy.
produce in the Hudson Valley.
Yeah.
And fruits, apples, you know, most importantly, you
Right.
know. Those are 2 mainstays of this. And those are...
But they're not growing corn? They're not growing soybeans?
I don't know.
They're not growing cotton?
Yeah. So those are very exceptional kinds of agriculture, right?
Right.
How so? What does that mean, like in terms of how they differ from, like, soybean? What does a soybean plant even look like?
A soybean plant kind of looks like a head of lettuce. Kind of. It's just like, when I look at pictures of it, it's like two big floppy green leaves. I'm just imagining now like a field, rows and rows and rows of soybean crops, which then get turned into oil that you can use to cook with. Renewable fuel standard, that's a really big thing in the industry where corn and soybean gets turned into the oil that you pump your gas with. So what is the difference between like a soybean farmer and a small acreage farmer?
Oh, so first, it's
Yeah, so the
necessarily acreage, right?
The terminology is different,
Okay.
yeah. So, gosh, where to begin? Big ag, traditional farming, is about economies of scale. The more acres you have, the more efficient you can be because you invest in the right equipment to pull all your stuff out of the ground, and then your tractor has sensors that pull data that you give to your agronomist who tells you need some more nitrogen over here. You're looking at anywhere between, 5,000 is going to be pretty small to, 50, 100,000 acres. Monoculture is a big thing in industrial ag. You grow the same thing mostly year after year. Tilling is really big, which environmentalists don't like because it releases all this nitrogen into the air, I believe. You don't even really have to work the land. You have lots of people working for you. I hear a lot about AI tractors. That's really big now. This is like tractors with arms that can do 40 rows at a time. And farmers, when I call them, love telling me this, they can watch it on their iPhone while they're at the coffee shop in town. I think what people would say is that they are not as connected to their land.
It's capital intensive, not labor intensive. Right?
For the owner, oh yeah, that's true, yeah, because you're buying all this equipment instead of having farm workers out there, though you will. Small acreage farmers is one way to describe this kind of movement that I think you guys have been studying. They don't do economies of scale. They grow enough just to sell to their clients, who are the restaurants or people like you and I who have a farm box. The other thing that I hear a lot when you talk about small acreage farmers or these specialty crop direct-to-market farmers is first generation. This is a huge issue. I think you guys read in the Nathan Rosenberg article that the guy, Chris from The Bachelor, is like a fifth generation farmer. That's pretty common in big ag because, again, this is just your family wealth that you're transmitting from generation to generation. When you're doing small acreage, you might be renting part of someone else's farm. You probably don't own your land. You're maybe only going to do it for a few years. I think you, when we talked, mentioned that you kind of felt like it was the AmeriCorps farming, which I think is an interesting analogy.
We did talk about, just the last farm that we visited, really smart entrepreneurial people. They're really into it. They work so hard and literally, not only doing the farm management and the building stuff, but they spend, so much time hunched over crops. And the question is, how long can you do that, right? So younger farmers can do that.
Yeah.
But the question of, as a business model, how sustainable is that kind of intensity?
It's not. The family farm, which I alluded to earlier, loses money every year. I looked at some statistic. It's like the smallest farms in America, their net income has been negative for 30 years. Only when you get into these big, concentrated, tens of thousands of acre operations do you actually start turning a profit. So just in a vacuum, if you want to go into business, farming is a bad idea. You don't make money farming. I think this is also a tension, as I understand it, in rural America. How to get the farm to stay in the family when kids know, I'm not going to make money here, I'd rather go into the city, which is an old story. Sorry, what was your...
No, so, just thinking, I guess in the larger point I'm trying to
Well,
get at.
I think what I was maybe on the cusp of saying is that if you're doing this, you don't go into it for the money, which is an unusual proposition because a farm is a business. So who goes into business not to make money? people who have the option of doing that, I suppose. People have the privilege of doing that.
And is, the goal to like replace big ag? I mean, that doesn't seem very viable at all.
No, I think, gosh, I interviewed this couple who, they were working in like very well-respected, renowned New York City restaurants, and they were getting to be in their 30s, and they felt like this work is too hard for us, so we're going to move back to Wisconsin and start farming organic grain instead. So that's odd, because as you point out, farm work is very labor-intensive. I know from my girlfriend's experience, so is restaurant work, but farming is probably even harder. It's more adverse conditions. I think their end goal is to create a product that they think is superior to what you can already find on shelves, or a consumer packaged good that is better than whatever grain you can buy right now. So maybe that's the end game. Not to farm, but just get better stuff into the marketplace.
Okay. Let's talk about race and justice in agriculture. I mean, that article that you co-wrote about Mark Bittman and that conflict, it was fascinating, and in so many circles he's so revered as not just like this great cooking writer, but increasingly very vocal and effective advocate for publicizing ideas that are out there about making food more sustainable and eating more sustainably, right? The question of like, can we eat so many animal-based diets? The whole gamut. He's sort of on the forefront of it. And this was just a fascinating incident that you reported, because he seemed totally blindsided by a whole other set of issues here. What's the context for that, and just how do you think about that at this point?
Sure. Well, there are a couple ways to sort of get into this conversation. One, I was thinking about on the way up here, is just like, what does it mean for a journalist to be an advocate? I mean, that is such a tricky needle to thread, because journalism is supposed to be objective. Your job is to get the facts and say what happened. And increasingly, as journalists get older and they feel like, well, this is stupid, fuck this, I'm gonna go for what I care about. I think for someone like Bittman, it might be hard to kind of shake that habit of the way he's been sort of conditioned to think about his work. At one point during this confrontation, it's sort of implied that he's at a remove, that he's not really on the ground with people. Well, that's what it means to be a journalist often. You sort of fly in and you figure out what's happening, and then you go and write it up and tell people what happened. But in this particular instance, Bittman had been invited as the keynote speaker to this young farming conference, young farming in this case being synonymous not with Chris from The Bachelor and his family's soybean farm, but young people who want to change the way food is produced and consumed. Sustainability, small acreage, all the things that you guys see in the Hudson Valley. And he was brought there because, as you mentioned, he is an advocate for what is seen to be a better way of producing food, a superior food system. And he was invited to talk about that, but also what's next for us. He sort of opened his speech. He said, we can talk about all the policy that we want, but like the truth is, no, he said that, but he ended up talking about policy. His idea is basically young farmers who are not white, who haven't inherited wealth, who don't have land, we need to find a way to make this work for you. And he was proposing basically undoing the Homestead Act. So this is after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, up until I think the 20s or 30s, the American government would give away parcels of land to mostly white people and white immigrants. You guys have all heard about this? Okay, so Bittman is saying, we need to fix this. The government should start reappropriating some of that land and finding a way to give it back to young people like you. And a woman in the audience says, hey, Mark Bittman, I'm a big fan. I've read some of your work. I myself am a cook and an educator. I design classes around some of your articles. I would really like it if you would respond to me, since I've emailed you a couple times and never hear back from you. And What you're saying up here is really great, but how do you hold yourself accountable to people like me and to people of color that you say you're trying to help? And I just don't think Bittman was ready for that kind of question. And he said, well, I don't really get it. What do you mean hold yourself accountable? And he was very brusque, dismissive. He kind of felt besieged, which he was a little bit. And ultimately this conversation unfolds right in front of us about, well, Mark Bittman, you have these ideas about land reform and giving land back to people from whom it was taken, but have you asked us to participate in this? Have you asked us for our ideas? How are we going to be a part of this instead of just another order coming down from on high? And I think that really triggered something in the sort of good food movement, I guess you could say, because I think often a lot of these good ideas are coming down from on high and they're not being generated from the ground up, which is a kind of cognitive dissonance. If you're talking about upending a system, how could it possibly be coming from people in positions of power rather than from the ground up? And insofar as race plays into this, I mean, I think you guys read the article, I mean, farmers are white through and through. It doesn't matter if they're doing big ag, it doesn't matter if they're selling direct to consumers. There are major structural barriers for people of color to get into farming. And it just seems like more talk, I think is what was happening. If you read one of the other responses that I included in the reading list, which is an interview with this woman, Nadine Nelson, what she's talking about, I think, is working in communities and actually being a part of these Black and POC communities where people are doing farming and could use allies and need to be part of the movement. I come back to this question about what is Mark Bittman's role, because journalists don't do that. Journalists, when they start becoming part of the communities that they are reporting on, you aren't a journalist, you're something else. You're an advocate, you're a former journalist.
And I guess it's interesting you use the term the good food movement, because I don't think it's as simple to say it's one way or the other, but the question is, good food in quotations, is it white, right? And what that means to talk about the whiteness of the good food movement. I'm just thinking, like the classic example I always hear, it's sort of the emblem is kale, right? Mm-hmm. Kale is something that in this area, like a lot of other farmers like to grow, they like to push. I have seen, education, food nutrition experts say, got to get more of this in. It's a leafy green. Often, particularly in communities like Poughkeepsie, people say, yeah, we have leafy greens in our diet too, and then it's something about like, well, you're, slathering this in oil or butter and it's, not healthy to eat it more, this way. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of interesting questions going on. And again, I don't even pretend to sort of know the answers here, but first the sort of, conflict over like what is good food and who has the knowledge about it. Where is it a community sort of context, or is it kind of a authoritative scientific context?
I think if you talk to a woman like Nadine, she would say it's a community context. I think in one of the articles I had, she talked about how the cooking curriculum that she develops is culturally responsive. It comes from what people grew up doing, what they know how to do, what they like to do. I mean, we know that food alone does not make people healthy. It has to be part of a bigger system. It has to be part of all these other things that you do. So again, I was writing about this rehab center that cook told me, no amount of kale, you can eat kale all day long, it's not going to make you healthier. But I guess, and again, if you guys know all this, like, jump right in or don't or whatever. But kale is, it's only expensive because it doesn't have that economy of scale that something like corn or soybeans do. I mean, I can't really imagine a world where kale is grown like a row crop, but if it was, it would be really cheap. And you'd see it everywhere, and it would be in everything, and we would probably power our cars using kale.
Yeah. Any questions about this? He's a source of expertise in a lot of things. It's just interesting having sort of looked at this literature, the issues that, this moment you're writing, this question has raised. are not new, but the thinking about it is relatively new. So, I mean, you know, the questions of race, land dispossession, which, Mark Bittman is trying to talk about.
Right.
But the accountability of, the good food movement.
Right.
Where do you see this going in coming years?
Good question. I think a lot of the Black and POC activists are very interested, despite the sort of inflammatory headline, in land reform. I mean, I think at the end of one of the articles, Nadine says, just please don't think about it. Just if you have land, start giving it away. There are people who advocate for land as a form of reparations, and there are databases where you can find people who are willing to give away their land to Black or POC farmers. I think you'll hear more about that. Just in terms of like the good, I mean, when you bring up kale, that's interesting because I think good food is starting to hit this tipping point where it just becomes more shitty processed food. Have you guys heard of Hampton Creek?
Mm-hmm.
This is a Silicon Valley startup that makes vegan mayonnaise, right?
Yeah, that's just mayo.
Yeah.
The stuff that they have in the desal.
Oh.
Cool. Okay. They just got into international food aid, and they have this powder called Power Gari, and it's you got a big bag of it, and you mix some water with it, and you mix it, and it becomes this kind of starchy pudding, and it's totally vegan, but like it's just junk. This is just lab-made like calories. So I think we will start getting to a place where things like non-GMO, vegan, all the stuff that consumers really care about, it will cross over into like, the same old stuff. Do you guys have any questions, or just what are you thinking about? I mean, like, what have you been doing?
Yeah, Nicole.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, wait, so what are your thoughts on like, not fake meat, but there's a lot of like Impossible Burger where they create plant-based sort of replacement products?
Yeah. I think it's being made because people want it. I think it's again, sort of what I was just talking about, satisfying this desire for certain consumer foods to be a certain way that don't have certain things in them. And technology is there now, we can do it. I mean, I think the Impossible Burger is now being served at Oakland A's games. Like, it will cross over into just being more junk food, I think.
Sort of, I guess, as large companies sort of get into sort of good food labels, the labels themselves are losing some of their meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, yes, totally, 100%. There are just different factions in different movements that are constantly advocating for new labeling to kind of restore their version of whatever it was. A recent fight in organic was over hydroponics, growing food organically in water, which to like the old guard is like heresy, because the point of organic is that you're enriching the soil and making it better. So USDA organic doesn't have to be grown in the soil, so now the old guard, the Organic Valley types, want this new organic certification. So yeah, it will just keep ratcheting and escalating, and you'll see more of it.
I am supposed to take him to lunch if we haven't eaten. I was going to take him like baby cakes. I'm sorry, the BC Kitchen. If I were to take Sam
When did it become the BC Kitchen?
If I were to take Sam to the Deese, a reporter from New Food Economy, and were to go to the ACDC,
Yeah, I
a
remember
fancy
these.
new one.
Can you still get milkshakes upstairs?
What would you point out to the reporter from the New
Pizza.
Food Economy?
Pesto.
What?
Really good pesto.
They have really good pesto. Not just in terms of taste. Like, what is like this? Just mayo is there, right? Where else do you see this kind of stuff in the
So
Deese?
they label when food is local and when it's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah,
That's
to me.
what I was gonna say as well, is like they label like what farms things are coming from as well.
How do you guys think about
Well,
Deese?
hang on, can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
All right. When I graduated, the vegan section of the Deese was the pasta stir fry station? Is there a more robust vegan section now, or is
Oh,
vegan
yeah.
just?
Vegan stuff is everywhere.
Okay,
Kind of.
Yeah.
but won't it be contaminated then by non-vegan products if it's everywhere?
Well, like, it's like, there's like vegetables at like the main station that are generally vegan, but then there's also the root station, which always has a vegetarian/vegan option. And then obviously like the salad bar, and then there's usually a vegan soup and like.
We also have
like
vegan
kosher.
pizza with vegan cheese, which, I mean, I'm sure these things are contaminated with vegan.
Well, and also
particles.
especially towards the beginning of the year when like Bon Appetit is still just like getting settled in, they would often have like cookies that would be labeled as vegan, and I was like, I'm pretty sure that those are not vegan. Like they just looked like normal cookies, and
Right.
so they've had a lot of issues with labeling for vegan stuff.
Was there a major redesign? Is that what I'm?
Yes, we have a new
Major.
food provider at the beginning of this year.
Yeah.
Bon Appetit,
Yes.
replacing
Aramark.
Aramark.
But they did a major redesign. You know,
Yes.
this is kind of like open loft.
Very
Oh,
nice.
exposed
It
beams?
looks like Pottery Barn.
Chipotle.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure you pointed this out by now, yeah.
Don't you think? We should take
Yes,
any deeds?
yeah.
Well, this is part and parcel of like the farming lifestyles. I'm
I
sure you
know.
guys are all
I know.
completely.
Well, and there was that famous Malcolm Gladwell podcast, which cast us as the not great
Oh,
food
yeah.
place. So, and yet, you
So
know,
you're
it's-
No, we were the great
Well,
food place.
Middlebury was the great food place, and we were
No, it's Bowdoin. It's
the
Bowdoin.
need blind policy.
Bowdoin?
Yeah.
Bowdoin, Bowdoin.
I get asked questions about that podcast.
And then, wait, can I just ask you guys?
Yeah, and so just to wrap up, I know we're out of.
Sorry, how many of you guys, do any of you come from farming families?
Or not a family, but I farmed my entire life.
Okay. What did you grow?
I worked on a farm that started out as just kind of, it was very similar to Sprout Creek in what we were growing.
Okay.
Kind of had a basic vegetable plot. We're cycling through different things for a CSA. We had some corn. We had a lot of basil. Tomatoes was a big crop for us. Potatoes was another big crop. We used to be an organic beef farm. Pioneered one of the first organic beef programs in the country, but we transitioned to organic dairy about 4 years ago with a grant from Stonyfield,
Cool. And where are you from?
Maine.
Great. And so the rest of you have not farmed before?
You know, this is a requirement for environmental studies major.
I
and
didn't
they
know
just-
that.
they
That's
get-
fascinating.
They get me, and I just am the one who said,
And you
like,
just
let's
come in
do-
and like labor
let's
them?
do agriculture, you know, because I know nothing about environmental science, right? You know, this is the only thing that like,
Okay.
the whole sets of issues that he's talked about are things that I think are just really exciting and interesting, so.
Well, and can I just ask you guys, like, what are you really interested in terms of this? Not to like pull away the veil, but like, why did you want to be in this class? What are you guys fired up about? Other than the fact that you had to be here?
And field trips.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's part of it, yeah.
I'm just generally very interested in creating a sustainable food system, and I've been vegan for almost 3 years now, and so it's something that I'm really aware of and trying to like still postulate like how to navigate people's individual circumstances that influence their food choices and how to create a sustainable food system.
I'm writing my thesis on food sovereignty. One of my cases is the townships in Maine that declared food sovereignty in like 2012. So
What did they declare?
they we're like we want our farmers to be able to sell to consumers without having to go through like federal food safety guidelines. If both parties are like consenting to that,
Cool.
and they like have this huge legal fight and then finally passed it. So
Nice.
it's cool stuff.
Anyone else want to add that? Okay, well, I know it's late, so I will see you guys Friday at our normal pickup. We got another hour-long trip.